Micah Lane had never spoken louder in his life. His small hand rested on his knee, but his chest was puffed with pride as he looked around the classroom, his voice clear and steady. "My dad works at NASA," he said. And just like that, the room changed. Not a pause for admiration, not gasps of awe like he'd imagined last night while practicing in front of his mirror. No. What came next was a short, sharp laugh from the front of the room. Mr. Redford, khakis creased, polo tucked in, eyebrows lifted with amusement. "NASA, huh?" he said, chuckling low in his throat. "Well, that's quite the imagination, Micah. Maybe next time we aim for something more realistic." That word realistic landed like a slap. A few kids snorted. One repeated the word under her breath like it was a joke they were all in on. Micah didn't speak again for the rest of the morning. He didn't raise his hand, didn't laugh at Dylan's silly dance by the vending machines, didn't join the race to the swings at recess. Something inside him folded. It wasn't just that his teacher didn't believe him, it was how easily he didn't. Like the very idea of Micah Lane's dad working at NASA was laughable. But what Mr. Redford didn't know, what no one knew, was that Micah had told the truth. And that the truth? It was about to walk through that classroom door, wearing a badge that would silence the room. Micah stared at the rug, the one with faded alphabet blocks and fraying corners that every third grader at Crest Hill Elementary had sat on at some point. Right now, it was the only thing he could focus on, the jagged blue edge near his sneaker, the way the thread peeled away like it was unraveling, kind of like him. Around him, the class carried on like nothing had happened. Dylan bragged about his dad being a firefighter. Chloe passed around tiny cupcakes her mom had brought from the bakery. Kids clapped, asked questions, even laughed again. Mr. Redford was back to his usual rhythm, clipboard in hand, calling on the next student with that performative cheerfulness he wore like a mask. But Micah didn't hear much. His hands, which had been animated just minutes earlier, now sat curled in fists on his lap. His backpack, where he had carefully placed the drawing of his dad holding a satellite and the Earth, now sat zipped tight, picture ripped in half, shoved deep into the bottom like a secret he no longer wanted anyone to see. He wanted to disappear into the rug, to press his palms into the fabric and sink, quiet and invisible, until the bell rang. A whisper pulled him back. "I believe you," said Lana. She sat to his right, small voice barely audible over the shuffling of chairs and crinkling of cupcake wrappers. She didn't say it loud, she didn't say it again. Just those three words, like she was handing him something fragile. Micah didn't answer. He only nodded slightly, eyes still locked on the rug. He hadn't imagined it. He knew he hadn't. His dad worked at NASA. He had the badge, the photos, the folders on the desk at home. But somehow none of that mattered anymore. Because one laugh had been enough to make him doubt everything. That was the part that hurt most. Not that the kids laughed, not even Mr. Redford's smirk. It was how easily it happened, how quickly he went from proud to pitiful, like his truth wasn't just unbelievable, but unworthy. The rest of the day blurred. He avoided eye contact, spoke only when called on. And when he finally made it to lunch, he sat at the far end of the table, picking apart his sandwich like it had wronged him. He barely noticed the swing sets, barely noticed the sun. Because somewhere between "that's quite the imagination" and "more realistic," something inside Micah Lane had gone quiet, and it didn't know how to come back out. 3 days earlier, the world felt lighter. Micah was perched on an overturned milk crate in the corner of the garage, sipping a Capri Sun and swinging his legs. The space smelled like dust and metal, and the floor was scattered with old wires and tangled cables, exactly the kind of chaos his dad loved. Across from him, Dr. Isaac Lane sat cross-legged on the floor, elbows deep in a storage bin of old connectors and tubing. A half-disassembled comms module lay beside him like a mechanical patient mid-surgery. Micah watched him with bright eyes, one hand balancing the juice pouch, the other raised in question. "Wait, so if the rover wants to send a message back to Earth, how long does it take?" Isaac didn't even pause. "Depends on where Mars is in orbit. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes up to 20. Micah's eyes widened. "That's like texting someone with really, really bad service." Isaac chuckled, pulling out a strip of tangled fiber. "Exactly. Space has the worst Wi-Fi." Micah laughed a full belly-deep sound. These were his favorite moments. No stage, no spelling tests, no rug to shrink into. Just him and his dad, making science feel like magic. On the workbench, a folder with the NASA logo sat beside a mug that read "Space Nerd" in faded blue letters. Micah eyed the folder, then looked up. "Can I bring this to school? Just one page?" Isaac followed his gaze, then shook his head gently. "Not allowed to bring classified stuff into 3rd grade, bud." "Not even a little?" Isaac smiled and sat beside him on the crate. "You don't need a folder. You've got everything you need right here." He tapped Micah's chest, over his heart. "Just tell them what I do. Be proud of it." Micah hesitated. "What if they don't believe me?" There was a pause. Then Isaac said, carefully, "Then that's their problem, not yours." Micah frowned. "But what if they laugh?" Isaac leaned back against the bench, his tone soft but steady. "Sometimes people laugh when they don't understand. But don't ever let someone else's doubt erase your truth. You know who I am, and I know who you are." Micah didn't fully understand the weight of those words yet, but he trusted the hands that built satellites and still found time to hold his shoulder gently. That night, he stayed up past bedtime drawing a picture of his dad holding Earth in one hand and a glowing satellite in the other. He couldn't wait to show it to his class. Micah had never felt so far away from that night in the garage. That night, he had gone to bed with the drawing tucked under his pillow, the satellite glowing in yellow crayon, his dad's hand stretched toward the sky. He'd whispered his lines to himself in the dark, testing out his space Wi-Fi joke one last time. Now, less than 24 hours later, the paper was crumpled at the bottom of his backpack, and he couldn't bring himself to pull it out. The classroom felt colder today. Or maybe Micah was just more aware of the space around him, how far the desks seemed from each other, how loud the clock ticked, how Mr. Redford hadn't looked him in the eye once since yesterday. Micah watched his classmates' faces light up as parents continued their career week presentations. Everyone clapped when Dylan's dad talked about putting out fires. Chloe passed out cookies shaped like rolling pins and aprons. Even the shyest kids had something to beam about, something to be proud of. Micah sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap. Not fists anymore, just still. Heavy. He had practiced so carefully. Every line, every word. He'd even tried mimicking the way his dad pointed at things when he explained space mechanics. But none of that had mattered, not after that laugh. Now, when he thought about standing up to speak, his stomach twisted. He tried to remember what his dad had said. The truth doesn't need applause, but truth felt so small here, tucked into a corner of a classroom where a single joke could turn belief into mockery. Mr. Redford called on Lana to share next, and as she stood, she gave Micah a quick glance. It wasn't pity, just quiet understanding. She hadn't said anything else since her whisper the day before. She didn't need to. Micah lowered his gaze again, letting her words replay in his head like a small song. "I believe you." But belief didn't feel like enough anymore. What if his dad didn't show? What if something came up at work? What if Mr. Redford was right, that this world Micah believed in, this truth he carried so proudly, didn't look realistic enough for someone like him? He told himself to stop thinking, to focus on math or spelling or anything else. But the thoughts didn't stop. They clung to him like shadows. And for the first time, Micah started wondering if the truth was strong enough to stand on its own. The clock read 1:24, 6 minutes until the final round of Career Week presentations. Micah had never been so aware of time, how slowly it moved, how loud each tick sounded, how every second felt stretched thin with hope and doubt. He sat in the 3rd row, eyes flicking between the wall clock and the classroom door. His knees bounced under the desk, his palms clammy, his breath shallow. What if his dad forgot? What if he got caught in a meeting? What if, despite everything, Micah ended up sitting there alone when his name was called? He tried to breathe the way his dad taught him when he got nervous before a science quiz. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. But today it didn't help. Not when the words "more realistic" still echoed in his ears. Across the room, Mr. Redford stood at the door, clipboard in one hand, glancing down the hallway every few moments. He was back in his element, hosting, smiling, moving on. But there was something different now, a flicker in his expression when he looked at Micah. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but something that hadn't been there before. Micah noticed it. He also noticed how Lana glanced over from time to time, just briefly. She didn't say anything, but her quiet presence had become its own kind of reassurance, soft and steady, in a day that felt like walking on glass. Mr. Redford stepped out into the hallway to wave in the next parent. Micah's eyes followed the door again, searching for that familiar silhouette, tall frame, pressed blazer, NASA badge shining under the lights. He imagined how the room would react. He wanted to believe in that moment, wanted to hold on to the idea that truth had a way of walking in, calm and undeniable. But belief was hard when doubt whispered louder. What if he's not coming? What if I don't belong in that story after all? Micah stared down at his desk, where the edge of a torn drawing still peeked from his folder. He slid it back inside and zipped it shut. Outside the window, the sun had begun its lazy descent, throwing streaks of gold across the tile. Inside, the classroom buzzed with anticipation. Another parent was getting ready to present. Another round of applause would follow. But for Micah Lane, the world had narrowed to the space between the ticking clock and the unopened door, and all he could do now was wait. The next name on Mr. Redford's list was halfway out of his mouth when the door opened on its own. Every head turned, and there he was. Dr. Isaac Lane stepped into the room, crisp navy blazer, white shirt, pressed slacks, and a small rectangular badge clipped to his chest, the unmistakable NASA logo gleaming beneath his name. He didn't rush. He didn't smile right away. He scanned the room with calm, quiet certainty until his eyes found Micah. Micah froze. His chair scraped back slightly as he sat up, spine straightening almost involuntarily. For a split second, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. His heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore. From something else, something like recognition. Isaac gave his son the smallest of nods. Then he looked at the class. "Hello," he said, voice steady and full. "I'm Dr. Lane. I design spacecraft." Silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the mocking kind. This silence felt different, heavy with realization. Even Mr. Redford stood still, clipboard wilting slightly in his hand, lips parted but no words coming. He blinked, glanced from Isaac to Micah, then down at his shoes. Micah watched it happen, the shift. The disbelief that had once filled the room didn't have anywhere left to go. He could feel eyes on him now, but not in the same way. They weren't laughing. They weren't smirking. They were just watching. Dr. Lane walked to the front of the room without fanfare. No props, no flashy slideshow yet, just presence. "So," he said casually, "you're learning about jobs this week?" A few kids nodded. One raised a hand. "Do you fly the rockets?" Isaac chuckled. "Not quite. I help build the systems that allow rockets to talk to us after they leave Earth." Another hand shot up. "Like space iPhones?" A grin. "Exactly, but with really bad reception." Laughter. Real laughter this time. Even Micah cracked a smile. Mr. Redford shifted uncomfortably near the bookshelf, watching this unfold like a guest in his own classroom. Isaac continued, unbothered by the teacher's silence. He spoke directly to the kids, making satellites sound like superheroes and data relays feel like magic tricks. But he never once mentioned what had happened earlier. He didn't need to. His presence had already said it all. Micah leaned back in his chair, still quiet, but no longer invisible. His truth was no longer a question mark hanging in the air. It had just walked through the door wearing a badge and a calm, undeniable voice. Dr. Lane clicked the remote. The projector hummed to life, casting the first image onto the screen. A high-resolution photo of Mars, its red dust swirling like smoke beneath a black sky. The room leaned in. "This," he said, "is where we've been sending robots. Machines that drive themselves, dig into soil, look for ice, and most importantly, send messages back to us. But those messages don't fly straight from Mars to your phones. That's where we come in." Slide by slide, he brought outer space down to Earth. He showed them the Mars Relay Network, a constellation of satellites floating in orbit, acting like phone towers in space. He explained how those satellites receive data from rovers and beam it back to Earth. "You could say we're the middlemen between planets," he said with a wink. "We make sure the messages don't get lost." Micah watched in awe, not just because his dad was explaining it all so well, but because the class was actually listening. Not zoning out, not laughing, listening. Mr. Redford stood off to the side, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. He hadn't said a word since Isaac walked in. And then came the final slide, a photo of Dr. Lane and Micah standing side by side at the Jet Propulsion Lab, matching NASA badges clipped to their shirts, both grinning under the weight of a giant model satellite. Gasps. A couple of kids whispered, "Whoa." Isaac looked out at the room one last time. He paused, not for drama, but for purpose. "By the way," he said calmly, "I heard someone earlier say that working at NASA might be unrealistic." He let the words sit there. He didn't look at Mr. Redford. He didn't need to. Then he turned, looked directly at Micah. "Well," he said with a small smile, "I guess some people have a different definition of realistic." A ripple moved through the room, soft but undeniable. Eyes shifted. Postures changed. Micah's chest rose. His fists, which had remained still through the entire presentation, finally relaxed. He looked around and saw something new in his classmates' faces. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Lana gave him a nod, like a promise fulfilled. "Mr." Redford cleared his throat. "Thank you, Dr. Lane. That was informative." Isaac glanced at the clock and smiled. "I've got to head back. Mars doesn't like to be kept waiting." A few kids laughed, but the loudest voice in the room was the one that had just been heard without ever needing to shout. The door closed behind Dr. Lane with a soft click, but the silence he left behind lingered like a faint vibration. "Mr." Redford stood frozen for a beat, clipboard in one hand, the other now shoved awkwardly into his pocket. The next name on his list escaped him. He glanced down, clearing his throat, but the usual rhythm of the day was gone, disrupted, rewritten. "All right," he said, voice thinner than usual. "Let's thank Dr. Lane for coming." Lana clapped first. A few others followed, but their eyes weren't on Mr. Redford anymore. They were on Micah, who now sat taller, chin slightly lifted, quiet pride blooming across his face like morning light. The next parent came in, a mechanic with a tire gauge. The kids were polite, asked questions, but the energy had shifted. Nothing sparkled the way it had a moment ago. Because once a man walks into a room and calmly redefines everything you thought you knew, cupcakes and car tools don't carry the same weight. When the final presentation ended and the bell rang, the usual rush of backpacks zipping and chairs scraping filled the room. Students filtered out into the hallway, voices rising like birds at dusk. But Micah didn't move. He stayed at his desk, hands folded, waiting. Mr. Redford approached, stopping just beside him. He shifted his weight, searching for something to say. "Hey," he began, voice light, too casual. "Your dad seems like a pretty smart guy." Micah looked up. "He is," Redford nodded. "Yeah, I can see that. I may have jumped the gun earlier." Micah didn't respond. The silence pressed in again. "I meant to say, sometimes teachers make mistakes. We don't always realize when something we say comes out wrong." Micah met his eyes. "But you laughed." Redford blinked. The words hit harder than expected. "Yeah," he said softly. "I did, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't right. I should have listened." Still, Micah didn't nod, didn't offer forgiveness. He simply stood, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, he turned slightly and said, "It wasn't my imagination. That's really my dad." Then he was gone. That night, the Arizona sun dipped behind the rooftops, streaking the sky in orange and rose. Micah sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, dinner by choice. His dad leaned against the counter, sipping from a chipped mug that read "Space Nerd." Neither of them spoke at first. Then Micah looked up and asked quietly, "Did you hear him when I said you worked at NASA?" Isaac nodded. "I did." Micah frowned. He laughed. Isaac took a slow breath. Sometimes people laugh when the world you describe doesn't fit inside the one they know. Micah stirred his cereal. "I didn't feel smart anymore." Isaac crossed the room and sat beside him. "Don't let someone else's doubt erase your truth. You know who I am, and I know who you are." Micah didn't say anything, but this time he smiled just a little. The next morning, Crest Hill Elementary felt different. Micah noticed it before the first bell even rang. As he stepped into the classroom, a few heads turned not with smirks or disbelief, but with something new, curiosity. He slipped into his seat quietly, as he always did, but the space around him no longer felt like a spotlight or a cage, it just felt open. During morning work, Jacob leaned over and whispered, "Has your dad ever met an astronaut?" Micah blinked, then gave a small shrug. "A few, I think." "Cool," Jacob said, sitting back like he'd just spoken to someone famous. Later, while walking to recess, Lana caught up beside him. "They believe you now," she said, voice light. Micah gave a small, thoughtful shrug. "They didn't have to," she smiled. "Still nice, though." On the playground, someone asked if Micah could bring one of his dad's space tools to class. Another kid wanted to know if Mars had earthquakes. Micah didn't puff up, he didn't brag. He just answered simply, like facts were enough, which, for him, they were. But he still felt the shift. Not in the way others looked at him, but in how he no longer needed them to. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the staff lounge, Mr. Redford sat alone with his lunch untouched and a folded sheet of notebook paper beside him. He stared at it for a long time before standing up, walking slowly to the cubby shelf outside the classroom and tucking the paper into Micah's slot. No name on the front, just a quiet fold. Micah found it after lunch. He didn't open it right away, just held it in his hand, the paper warm from the sun through the window. Back at his desk, he unfolded it carefully. A few lines of handwriting stretched across the page. Micah, I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big. Mr. Redford Micah read it once quietly. He didn't smile, didn't read it again. He folded it neatly and slipped it into the front pocket of his backpack. He hadn't needed the apology, but maybe someone else had needed to write it. That afternoon, as the final bell echoed through the halls of Crest Hill Elementary, Micah Lane didn't rush. He zipped his backpack slowly, tucked the folded note from Mr. Redford beside his homework folder, and slid his chair in neatly. Around him, the usual chaos unfolded: shouts, laughter, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against tile. But Micah moved with calm, like the world had finally caught up to a truth he'd always known. He stepped into the hallway, the Arizona sun slanting through the windows in soft golden beams. Lana gave him a small wave from down the corridor. Jacob was still asking someone if astronauts ever eat pizza in space. And for the first time in days, Micah didn't feel like shrinking from the noise. He felt solid, real, enough. Not because people finally believed him, but because even when they hadn't, he had spoken anyway. Outside, his dad's car was already parked near the front. Dr. Lane leaned against the side door, arms crossed, same space nerd mug in one hand. When he saw Micah approach, he didn't say anything right away, just smiled that quiet, knowing smile. "How was today?" Isaac asked as Micah climbed in. Micah buckled his seatbelt. "Better," he said. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the kind that didn't need filling. The radio played softly, something instrumental, gentle. Micah looked out the window at the dusty trees and pink-tinged sky. "I kept the note," he said finally. Isaac glanced over. "From your teacher?" Micah nodded. "I didn't need it, but I think he did." Isaac smiled. Sometimes the apology isn't for the one who was hurt. Sometimes it's the first step for the one who did the hurting. Micah leaned his head against the window. The light flickered across his face as they passed the familiar curve in the road leading home. "I didn't feel small today," he said quietly. "You never were," his dad replied. And Micah believed it, because the truth had walked in wearing a badge, had stood tall without raising its voice, had smiled instead of shouting, and that truth had stayed with him long after the silence ended. At home, he placed the note inside his drawer, not as proof but as a reminder that when the world doubts you, when it laughs or dismisses or demands something smaller, your voice still matters. Because truth doesn't need permission, it only needs someone brave enough to speak it out loud. And Micah Lane had done just that. In life, the most powerful truths are often the quietest ones. This story reminds us that belief, especially in the hearts of children, is fragile, yet formative. A single laugh, a passing doubt from someone in authority, can silence a voice before it ever fully finds itself. But just as quickly, one act of presence, one calm affirmation, can restore what was nearly lost. For older generations who've lived through decades of change, this story is a gentle call to remember the influence we hold. Whether as teachers, grandparents, neighbors, or mentors, our words carry weight sometimes more than we realize. Dismissing a child's truth might take seconds, but the echo of that moment can last a lifetime. We are reminded, too, that truth doesn't demand applause. It doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it simply walks into a room dignified, steady, and undeniable. And in that, there is great power. So if ever given the choice, let us be the ones who choose to believe, to listen, and to encourage, especially when the world tells someone their dreams are too big. Because often, the right kind of belief can change not just a day, but a life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.